borrowing inside the Ethereum ecosystem. Yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
Yep. And yeah, my name is Michael. I'm the CEO of Curve. So Curve is automatic market maker for stablecoins, or at least currently for stablecoins, which was launched this January, and seemed to be grew up to about 10 million in liquidity, and yeah. So I guess that's about it.
Allison.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Allison. I'm the co-founder of UMA. Our mission is to enable universal market access. That's right there in the name. What we do is we build open source financial infrastructure for Ethereum, specifically two things. One is a decentralized Oracle service, a Schelling point system, and two is smart contract design patterns that let you create synthetic ERC20 tokens that can track the price of anything.
Okay, so today's panel is on exploring alternatives to stablecoins, and I think also the future of stablecoins. So let's start off by asking, is trustlessness actually important when it comes to stablecoins?
I think, you guys want to go?
Sure. So maybe I'll kick it off with a little bit of an unpopular conversation, given that we're at a DeFi meetup. But I think the average user really doesn't care so much about trustlessness or decentralization for that matter. They really just care about utility. Does the product actually trade at its peg, and is it sufficiently liquid? That being said, depending on the specific construct or design of the stablecoin, you can see that meaningfully impacting kind of both. So for a centralized stablecoin, for example, you may actually see yourself being unable to access it because they can manage centralized blacklists or freeze your tokens. And for decentralized stablecoins, depending on how they're constructed, you might see them either fall from the peg or have periods of low liquidity or higher volatility. And so a lot of times it ends up coming down to trade-offs and kind of the right stablecoin for the.
So how does where does UMA fit within that view?
As in, what is the UMA house view?
I mean, you create synthetic assets. What are its strengths versus like DAI or USDC, which are both different mechanisms, right?
Yeah. So the infrastructure that we've created is really for very generic synthetic assets. You could create a synthetic asset that tracks the dollar backed by ETH, similar to how DAI does, for example, or you could create a synthetic asset that tracks Bitcoin backed by DAI for all we care. And so really the approach that we've taken in designing our infrastructure is to make it really usable, extensible, and flexible. And it's not exactly, it doesn't express an opinion about how stablecoins should be created necessarily.
Okay, what are your views, Stani or Michael, on whether or not we're creating this DeFi economy, and currently it's kind of revolving around one decentralized project maker and their stablecoin. Is this good? Do we just need a battle test DAI more, make it work better? Or should we have like this landscape of different types of assets where some of them aren't trustless, such as USDC?
Yeah, I think actually both trusted and trustless assets are important, like exactly as Allison said. When you want to go into the DeFi ecosystem or want to go out, you want to connect your basically your bank account to this system, and that's where coins like USDC are very good because you can pretty much deposit money and convert to stablecoin and back, and then once you have a stablecoin, you can exchange it into anything. But like the trustless aspect is also important, and it's not only because of the ability to freeze. Imagine that you have euros, for example. Like if you thought about it, like why doesn't digital euro like fully exist on blockchain yet? And I think the reason is that if you want to make a trusted stablecoin, you need you can use like the business model of basically putting money in the bank, issuing a stablecoin, and then getting interest for the bank deposit as a company revenue. And even if that interest is small, like 0.5% per year or something, that's still meaningful. Well, for euro, interest is negative, so this business model clearly doesn't work. And that's where the algorithmic stablecoins are really good. And if we will switch to the world with negative interest for even USD, that will be even more needed. So maybe we will have like negative interest trusted stablecoin with relatively low cap, and then like exchanging that to trustless and back. Well, if the world really goes into negative interest mode.
Wait, are you there in saying that you think a future version of USDC or some competitor will have built into it this negative interest rate itself?
Well, I mean, if that interest rate happens, that's possible. Well, I mean, of course, company can pay out of its investments, but then the company should make money on something else. And that's also possible. Let's say if you on trading between that stablecoin and some trustless stablecoin.
I guess, yeah, what potentially could happen is if indeed all interest rates across the world for central banks go below zero, indeed, you know, in a way you're suggesting there could be some sort of exodus, some sort of people fleeing to decentralized versions of fiat currencies, which would be a very, very good thing for our industry. Even though it wouldn't impact the price directly, but it would definitely mean like actual utilization and legitimate use cases of our space increase. Yeah. And
actually, that's interesting because let's say if you have a stablecoin USD and you have negative rates on the fiat peggings, and people are fleeing from those fiats to their like cryptographic counterparts and increasing demand. So let's say if it's in case of algorithmic stablecoins like DAI, how much that increases the DAI demand, and what happens to DAI? It gets basically overpriced. So in that sense, like I don't think you can kind of like avoid the differences in rates, because you have to pretty much follow the underlying. For example, if the rates will be negative, you have to apply the similar negative rates in the cryptographic world as well. Otherwise, people just jump there into the cryptographic counterpart and increase the demand of that. Let's say, for example, DAI, and you have to apply some sort of like negative rates there to whether it's, for example, the DSR or CDPs stability fee to.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Just like what's interesting for me is actually like not just the fact that like there might be like the negative rate economy, but like how these different economies like we have, which is like now even more important discussion, because like obviously the U.S. government and rest of the governments in the world, they need to kind of tweak and reapply their monetary policies, and like seeing like how where does the like cryptographic economy, crypto economics basically stand on this? Like can't it actually when you're pegging to another economy, which is happening in terms of pegged stablecoins, can you actually differentiate from that economic policy, or do you have to follow that in a par? So that's like the very interesting, like to see like how they will work in parallel, and can you deviate from their like fiat monetary policies?
I mean, that really does open like Pandora's box of questions in a way. I think indeed, like the problem we face today with seeing, you know, like the old world move into decentralized stablecoins such as DAI is indeed the fact that the price keeping mechanism for DAI isn't robust enough, right? The fact that it is, you know, trading a few dollars or a few cents above a dollar. It's this good.
Yes, yeah, I think in some ways, like even like we might see like in very, very short term, like that there's some sort of like robustness missing from there. But end of the day, it's kind of like a working system, and it really tracks back. I mean, things that happened recently, and the so-called Black Thursday and so forth. I mean, those were very good stress tests, and pretty much DAI survived from those incidents. So that's like, and in the background, there was an incident that basically more maker had to be minted, of course, against a price. So there was like nothing wrong in that. But like even though there's like differentiate that there's like sometimes the price difference is I mean, like you don't have the exact peg. Of course, it might be because of the added risk of the smart contracts or the crypto economy or whatnot, but it's also a liquidity question. Like that's like the biggest thing here in the DeFi space is that like all the rates, like even if you go to let's say to Aave Compound or you go to Curve, like they kind of like their interest rates and the pegs of the different stablecoins, they should be pretty much the same and arbitraged. But there is just like this very, very big inefficiency in the DeFi space. And I think like what basically Michael said, and Allison, like what I'm trying to refer is that like the more there's like different kinds of values and liquidity and different kinds of stablecoins, whether they're like algorithmic or fiat-backed stablecoins, it's about bringing more liquidity and then like reducing those different kinds of inefficiencies. So like I will not be too much worried yet, like if there's like some like 1%, 2%, 3% differences between stablecoins, but I think like things like Curve and UMA and so forth are trying to basically solve is to get that in a long term, like those efficiencies out of it. But these systems are very, very young still.
Yeah, I actually agree completely that a lot of what happened was really more of a liquidity issue. One of the things that I think makes stablecoins quite difficult is if you think about like what the promise of a decentralized stablecoin is, it's supposed to the stated promise is around maintaining a peg of exactly or more or less exactly $1 at all times. But $1 is something that is actually pegged to a very long run expectation. What I mean is the US Federal Reserve, when they're trying to enact monetary policy, they're trying to target a long run inflation target of about 2%. What does long run mean? It's like 30 plus years. And obviously the US economy is not sitting at a 2% inflation rate at every single point in time. So if you have like a real asset, a dollar, that's targeted to a very long run expectation with monetary policy that targets that long run expectation, and then you have the synthetic asset DAI that's trying to target a dollar, trying to get everything in line perfectly at all points in time is a huge challenge. I think that if DAI's stated purpose was more around targeting $1 expectation in the long run, for example, well, very, very clearly it's done a great job, I think, of actually being able to maintain that long run expectation. It's these short-term fluctuations due to near-term supply and demand dynamics that kind of can cause things to be a little bit unmoored. So if you think about what tools then a traditional central bank has to fix these short-term fluctuations. In the US's case, short-term fluctuations in inflation, or in MakerDAO's case, short-term fluctuations in liquidity. They've already taken the extreme measure of adding USDC as a new collateral type to introduce additional liquidity for the creation of DAI when DAI is trading above the peg. And that's, I guess, been somewhat successful, or at least there's been uptake on that, many long-run implications. I'm kind of curious about what the opposite liquidity measure would be. If ETH starts to moon again and ETH prices go up, well, DAI supply is driven by demand for borrowing a DAI against ETH. And so who's to say that the DAI won't fall below peg again, and who's going to be the liquidity provider below the peg?
I guess I totally agree with this analysis. I just wanted to add that I think that just using one lever, which is pretty much interest rate or stability fee, is probably, well, it's enough to keep the price long term, but on the short term, I think something like a monetary policy is needed. Like, for example, I mean, although this wouldn't be 100% trustless, imagine that we had a smart contract which is able to access issuing DAI and burning DAI as well. So imagine that if DAI is above the peg, right, like right now, this smart contract can issue, just print more DAI and sell it on the market to get, I don't know, USDC, right? And then later, like let's say if price goes to 1.0, this smart contract doesn't do anything because the price is already at the peg. And if the price is lower than 1.0, then the only thing this smart contract can do is to basically buy DAI with reserves of USDC it collected. So it kind of creates the opposite force for the DAI price. Of course, like when it's out of USDC collected at the times of expensive DAI, then it cannot really provide this force anymore. But at least this operation seems to be always profitable, and in the long run, you wouldn't have any like excess of printed DAI. So this and this would just be some faster lock-in mechanism. And of course, still can work in concert with the existing slowish lock-in mechanism.
Even on the slow mechanism, though, like the stability fees and level of interest rates in crypto are meant to moderate supply and demand over time. But I think actually the reality is that most people who are collateralizing ETH to borrow DAI are actually not very price sensitive. Like you see no correlation between new vaults opened or new CDPs opened relative, or very little correlation between that and the stability fee. What the stability fee does do is enable higher interest rates paid to DAI holders, where DAI holders do tend to be quite price sensitive, and so they would be willing to provide more liquidity to ETH borrowers when interest rates are high. But it's just really interesting that the things that are meant to moderate supply and demand in the monetary supply in our economy's case, in the crypto economy's case, tend to be kind of one-sided at a time.
So, very different type of question. Is the dollar even the right currency at all to kind of like revolve our new Ethereum economy around, right? Like, it makes sense, right? All trading volume has historically been in dollar in our industry. It's like seen as like the world reserve currency. But, we are trying to create a new economy altogether, right? Something that comes after the old world. And so, like, for example, the original DAI white paper wasn't actually trying to create a tokenized dollar, a decentralized dollar. It was trying to create a currency that was more stable, right? So it would use the standard drawing right or the special drawing right, which was the basket currency of dollar, euro, pound, yen, and yuan. And the idea was that DAI, that was originally what DAI was supposed to be, would be more stable than all of these currencies independently. And so this was what attracted me a lot to Maker originally. I understand it was simplified for traction reasons, but ultimately, this whole incident kind of makes me feel that we are kind of pegging ourselves to the old world economy when it's exactly that which we're trying to replace, right? And so, yeah, I can come up with like different methods where like over time, like it transitions, where it starts out as 100% dollar DAI, and over time it slowly goes to something else. But I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's even a good question of what the value should be pegged to. I think pegging to a basket of currencies is probably not necessarily very good, because everything right now is very correlated to US dollar. And if US economy falls, other economies fall too. So it probably like that wouldn't really diversify enough. It's maybe a little bit like having an index of different cryptocurrencies which go together with Bitcoin, right? So it's a good question, like what exactly should this ideal decentralized stablecoin peg to?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that you'd unmuted. So I think it kind of goes to the use case here. So if you think about like what's driving the crypto economy, a lot of it is really trading. And so having a stable medium of exchange is really, really useful. And just having something simple and understandable be that medium of exchange, like the US dollar, is way more practical and useful than having a basket of 10 different currencies that you need to think about every single time that you do a trade. That being said, one of the other use cases for money and potentially stablecoins is as a store of value. And here, like an interest-bearing stablecoin like Chai or CDAI kind of starts to fulfill that purpose. If you think about the yields that that stablecoin is earning, in theory, by global purchasing power parity, that should actually get you to an equivalent return as owning a globally diversified basket of currencies. But actually, that narrative is competing against ETH itself, and the narrative of ETH or Bitcoin or any other layer one cryptocurrency as being a store of value. So I think the jury is still out here on whether stablecoins are going to be at all useful as a store of value in the future, or whether they'll exclusively stay in the realm of being a medium of exchange, while other layer one cryptocurrencies, pick up the store of value.
Yeah, I wanted to just add that I had an interesting I had a boilerplate answer to this one, but then I was thinking does it actually really matter? I mean, in terms of USD, you're basically pegging not just US economy, but as global economy as much as USD is traded, and kind of then you have a few other bigger fiat currencies. In terms of if you want to pick something very global, I mean it's pretty much USD at the moment, and I'm just thinking how much difference it will be if we kind of have a basket, a derivative basket, and with these different currencies, because it's always a relative. USD is relative to, let's say, pounds are relative to, because they all fluctuate and so forth. And I think what Michael said about having basket of cryptocurrencies is kind of same effect. I think it's good for risk diversification, but for the end user to just business, as whether it's enterprise or consumer, it's just you want something that it's easy for the UX side, and also basically something that stores value that the current layer ones aren't providing that, because the economy is so small, right? And what's funny thing, very funny thing now is that if you look at all of the different kinds of assets, and especially time like this when the market is going down, one of the big arguments for layer one is that let's say Bitcoin is a it functions as a store of value and whatnot. And if you look at all of the different kinds of assets, it's pretty much like when everything else is going down, it's pretty much people are jumping into gold, and like that's the current store of value. And even the Bitcoin and all the cryptocurrencies, they're going down to the market at an even bigger scale because of the small size of the market and less diversity compared to the traditional financial assets. So my kind of point here is that like even if we have a derivative basket, like does it solve anything, or like what do we want to solve? Because like I definitely understand that USD is now pretty much the global trading thing, but of course like we could get rid of the like monetary supply. That's the kind of like only use case I see, because like the thing with national currencies is that they give a lot of flexibility for that particular country. For example, if you think about Eurozone, and we're all in the same Eurozone, and there's countries in European Union that are not, for example, Denmark, Sweden. So having own national currency does give like monetary policy, and maybe taking that into the like crypto ecosystem and having some sort of DAO that could work, like what Maker is trying to achieve. But the current obstacle, of course, is that their monetary policy is like the one.
From a user's perspective, isn't the ultimate goal to do just better than what people have today? So people don't really understand monetary policy necessarily, but having Chai, as Allison mentioned, or ADAI, or another interest-bearing version of the dollar is literally a net like positive over regular dollar, right? And so why wouldn't virtually everyone at this point be holding all their money at all times in something like ADAI or Chai? Assuming that on a technical level it's as robust as the base version of dollar and there's no like additional risks, right?
Well, I don't think you can get rid of the additional risks though. You know, the reason why you're earning income on your DAI or yield on your DAI is because it's presumably being used and lent and borrowed somewhere. And so in the case of like ADAI or CDAI, if lending pool usage is very high, you may not be able to redeem your interest-bearing DAI for regular DAI if you had some use case for it. So as the user, you are bearing some liquidity risks when you do that, and that's where the compensation comes from.
I guess one risk.
Yeah. So sorry, Michael.
I guess one risk which we probably don't account for is a risk of the national currency going down dramatically fast. This happened with many currencies in the world, and who knows, maybe it will happen with US dollar pretty soon, right? That like if the Fed starts printing, it definitely can happen. And this would be like a dramatic fall in purchasing power. So then the question is it like to avoid that risk, which wouldn't be fixed by just earning interest rate, would it be possible to create a currency which is pegged to actually purchasing power? And would it even be useful? So that's...
What do you mean with purchasing power in this case? How would you... Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's say with 1 unit of currency, you're able to purchase some amount of goods, and let's say you will be able to purchase this same amount of goods for 1 unit of currency in future. That's kind of zero inflation.
So what could that mean? Does that mean that if at some point in a few years, almost every asset is represented on the blockchain, on Ethereum, whether it's gold or wheat or oil, right? Would there be something there to create some sort of basket token, which, unlike the original DAI, which was supposed to be yen, dollar, euro, yuan, and the pound, what if instead it was not just those fiat currencies, but rather maybe hundreds of different assets, all weighted in a particular way, and that is the currency a normal person holds, rather than, US dollar, right?
Right. Yeah, and then, well, the governments, they do measure purchasing power of national currencies to measure inflation, and they do have inflation targets. So why wouldn't a stablecoin have zero inflation target, for example?
Yeah, just to add on that quickly, that I mean, one interesting question is like, I mean, whether like could a stablecoin be without a monetary policy, or like, I mean, could there be like some sort of, or is it even possible to be a stablecoin without a monetary policy? Because if you think about DAI, it has a monetary policy, right? But it has to follow USD. No matter what you do, I mean, you have the little area of basically the crypto economics, the decentralized usage, but the underlying what you're pegging is another monetary policy. But I think like whatever you have governance, whether it's DAO-like governance or Bitcoin-like governance or so forth, or I think probably that's something that we can't get rid of. Like there will be always governance and monetary governance as well. But the interesting thing is what will be the substance, because now in terms of dollar, you can do all kinds of things. For example, if you need to boost the economy, I mean, if the economy is if you need to boost the economy, you can apply negative rates, and for example, if the economy is overheating, you can basically inflate the interest rates, and kind of like we don't have the similar yet. For example, in the MakerDAO system, currently we have the stability fee on lending out DAI and the secondary market interest rates, like in Compound and Aave. But we don't have, for example, the other side, the negative rates. So we kind of like, we don't control the whole risk there. But that's like the question, like how will the monetary policy look like if there will be like a basket or something we're pegging to directly into economy or real value instead of like the dollar or so forth.
Yeah, I think, to be practical, we're just really far away from that. Like, all of us on the phone call here, we all live in different countries. We all live in different economies. The people in each of our respective countries have a very wide diversity of standards of living. Back when I worked at Goldman, one of the fun things that our economists used to talk about was the Big Mac index. So how many dollars, pesos, or shillings, or whatever local currency does it take to buy a Big Mac in any given country? And that was a really good proxy for, it was a generic fun proxy for how strong the purchasing power of any given currency is. But even at beyond or even more granular than the national level, you can go down to a state or provincial level, you can go down into a township level, and you can even go down into an individual household level. The standards of living there are really quite dramatically different. I think it's going to be a pretty long time before we can get to a single stable coin or a single basket of goods that is equally relevant to everybody participating in these economies.
So, I was going to go to the questions, but do you guys remember Nubits? You do, Michael?
Yes,
So for everyone on the stream, Nubits was, as far as I know, the first big attempt at a decentralized version of a regular fiat currency, right? So before Ethereum even, right? It wasn't, so it was like MakerDAO, or it was attempting to do what MakerDAO has achieved before Ethereum. I believe it was built on Mastercoin or something like that, and it failed, right? So it maintained its peg. You can see on CoinMarketCap, it maintained its peg at $1 for a while, and at some point, I don't know what happened, but it all went very, very wrong.
Yeah, well, I think it was I think there were like new shares and new bits which had dollars. So, and new shares were collateralizing the new bits dollars. So the actual like coin of the system itself collateralized the stablecoin, as if maker collateralized DAI, right? And that's actually a little bit dangerous idea, because if the system starts collapsing, it will just make the collapse faster, because like if the underlying collateral collapses with the system, then it also collapses the value of the stablecoin. And like while DAI has ETH as collateral, it's sufficiently decoupled from the maker ecosystem, so it probably will bring more resilience. But yeah.
So I guess indeed the like ultimately I think we all very much appreciate the work that Maker has done to actually build this amazing, engine to make a working stablecoin, even though, like we're still all trying to make it more robust. But ultimately, it's the fact that it has gone through this shock and survived is quite amazing in and of itself.
That being said, if you look at it, NewBits existed for like, I don't know, 2 years. I think it lost the peg at some point, but it went back, and it was more or less working as a stable coin for 2 years. So I think probably to really battle test Maker, we would need to observe for even longer time.
Yeah, and I just want to add, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to add like how like important the Maker is for the ecosystem. I mean, like as a decentralized stablecoin, and of course like other ERC20 stablecoins, because like when we launched like the kind of like first lending protocol, ETHLend, there wasn't any basically stablecoins, so people were borrowing either ETH, and you had the calculation issues, and same, you basically borrowed ETH, peg it to the USD, and returned ETH, peg it to the USD. So it was like very like painful for the borrowers and lenders, and also like that was the period when all the assets were not that liquid. So I think like the work that the Maker has done in the past is pretty important. Like, and I think the whole ecosystem is aiming towards the goal that we want to make this particular stablecoin to work. Like that I mean, everyone wants diversity, right? I mean, even though like we all love Maker, it's always best that there is like alternatives and as decentralized as possible. But like I think that the focus of the ecosystem is that the first thing will get it right. And I think there is always criticism, and I think it's good because that keeps always like the pressure in innovation and doing things right. But I would say that the other stablecoins are equally important, and I think one of the interesting parts where we reached before the actually deficit of the Maker protocol was actually the kind of like under collateralization of the Tether in their system, that basically we don't have a system anymore where one dollar in the bank account equals one cryptographic token. Like we basically don't have the system. We didn't have the system anymore, and still people trusted because like if you think about it, Tether is the most trusted stablecoin. I mean, all the the stuff that has happened, the allegations and everything, and people still trust it in a very high scale. And one of the reasons is that I mean, they definitely had one of the first mover advantages. And if you trade, for example, what some of the borrowers are doing in our protocol, they're basically borrowing against their asset that they're long, for example, ETH, to a stable coin, which is the most cheaper. And they might, for example, borrow the cheapest one, go to Curve and change it to other stable coin that is more liquid in the OTC market, for example, Tether, and then they convert it to fiat currencies to pay actual salaries and bills and whatnot. So like the liquidity is very big there, and I think that's that's like one of the important things for stable coins to work is the liquidity, and if people trust a stable coin so much, like in Tether's example, like there's the liquidity, and I think there's always a risk of failure. So I definitely think diversification is very important. But I also like I'm very sure that.
So we have one more question, Stani, because we're going over time. So there's one question from the audience which I'm highlighting, which is from Amin from Spankchain. He talks about reflex bonds, and I don't know what they are, but he thinks that is some sort of. He doesn't elaborate further. Does anyone know?
So if I understand with the reflex bond is that you don't beg to anything, that you have a price target that you're trying to follow and achieve. I think this boils down to the discussion that there was at the MetaCoin group, where basically Amin is very active, and also there's one of the founders of the MakerDAO system. I mean, previous founders, Nikolai was basically proposing as but I'm not quite sure about that, like because I'm not heavily introduced to that system in reflex bonds. I think maybe you guys know more.
I don't think I know the specific mechanism of a reflex bond, but I think the general concept is that rather than having governance-based stability fees, you have market-based fees or some sort of feedback mechanism where interest rates can go either extremely positive or extremely negative, depending on how well your synthetic asset is holding the peg. So I think it's a way to reduce the governance burden of the system while still anchoring long-run expectations to a certain target. And I think it's a very reasonable alternative to having such a governance-heavy system as MakerDAO does. But then you kind of run into the potential problem of exacerbating liquidity crises.
Yeah, I just want to add that actually, like in my opinion, the governance is kind of like an illusion, because like you actually have to listen to the market, and very carefully. And the more carefully you listen to the market, the better policy you will apply. So the governance is actually basically intermediary there that listens to the market, and actually you have a you have to have a market-based kind of like a currency. Otherwise, I mean, you can't go against the market. I mean, that's just like doesn't work that way. So even though like there is a governance structure, for example, in the MakerDAO system, pretty much they have to do what the market does and react to that basically level.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This was fun. All right. I think we're going on to the next.
Yeah, and about the one thing about the future stablecoins, I recommend to follow the MetaCoin projects. That's pretty interesting as well. So,
which is it? It's called MetaCoin.
Yeah, MetaCoin is on research, and I think Amin, who asked the question, it was the one who introduced it over there.
All right, Michael, Stani, Allison, thank you all very much. Speak soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.